Tonight, as you settle into the quiet sanctuary of your evening, we're exploring a profound truth that Carl Jung discovered over a century ago. A truth that whispers through the corridors of every human heart. You might think that being constantly available to others is a sign of love, generosity, or strength. But Jung revealed something far more mysterious. When you stop being endlessly available, when you consciously withdraw your energy from the demands and expectations of the world, something miraculous begins to unfold within you. It's not selfishness that emerges, but rather a kind of psychological alchemy. The transformation of your very essence into something more authentic, more whole, more genuinely capable of love. If you're enjoying these philosophical journeys into the night, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells me you're finding value in these gentle explorations of the mind and spirit. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. There's something beautiful about knowing we're all drifting into these ideas together, scattered across time zones, but connected through Jung's timeless insights about the human psyche. Now let's prepare for tonight's journey into the depths of psychological wisdom. Dim the lights around you, perhaps light a candle if that helps you unwind, or maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum that seems to carry thoughts along more gently. Feel your body settling deeper into whatever surface supports you, a bed, a chair, a couch, and notice how your breathing naturally wants to slow as we ease into tonight's exploration of what Jung called the sacred act of becoming unavailable to what drains us, so we can become truly available to what nourishes our authentic self. Imagine you've just stepped into Carl Jung's study in Zurich, Switzerland, on a cool autumn evening in 1913. The amber light from his desk lamp casts long, dancing shadows across walls lined with leather-bound volumes on psychology, mythology, and ancient wisdom traditions. You notice the smell of pipe tobacco, not unpleasant, but distinctive, mixing with the scent of old books and the faint aroma of coffee that lingers from his afternoon session with a patient. As you settle into a well-worn leather chair, feeling its smooth surface against your skin, you hear the gentle tick of a grandfather clock and the distant murmur of the Limmat River flowing through the city. Jung is seated at his desk, writing in his famous red book, completely absorbed in mapping the hidden territories of the human soul, and you realize you're about to understand something profound about the paradox of withdrawal and connection. This is Jung at a crucial moment in his own journey, having recently broken from his mentor Sigmund Freud, feeling both liberated and deeply alone. Like many of us who have had to step away from relationships or situations that no longer served our growth, Jung was learning that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to stop being available to dynamics that diminish us. He was discovering that what the world often labels as selfishness or withdrawal might actually be the psyche's intelligent response to depletion, a natural movement toward restoration and authenticity. Consider for a moment the last time you felt truly drained by someone's constant demands on your attention, your energy, your emotional resources. Jung understood that this exhaustion wasn't simply a matter of poor time management or weak boundaries. He saw it as a fundamental disruption of what he called libido, not sexual energy, as Freud had insisted, but the total life force that animates our being. This energy, Jung realized, has its own intelligence, its own natural direction, and when we continuously give it away without conscious choice, we begin to lose touch with our own essence. What if the people who exhaust us aren't simply difficult personalities, but mirrors reflecting back our own unconscious patterns of self-abandonment? Jung discovered that those who drain us most effectively are often those who hook into our deepest fears of rejection, our childhood wounds around worthiness, our unconscious belief that we must earn love through constant service. They become, in a sense, external manifestations of our own inner conflicts, the parts of us that have never learned to say no, to set boundaries, to honor our own needs as sacred. As you sink deeper into that leather chair in Jung's study, you might notice how the flickering lamplight creates the illusion that the shadows on the walls are moving, shifting, almost alive. This is how Jung came to understand the psyche itself, not as a static collection of memories and drives, but as a dynamic, living system constantly seeking balance and wholeness. The part of us that gives endlessly to others while neglecting ourselves isn't the full picture of who we are. It's often what Jung called the persona, the social mask we wear to gain acceptance and avoid rejection. But beneath this accommodating surface lies our shadow, containing all the qualities we've learned to see as unacceptable. Our anger, our selfishness, our fierce protectiveness of our own energy and time. Perhaps you've felt this yourself, that exhausted resentment that builds when you've said yes too many times, when you've been available to everyone except yourself. Jung saw this not as a character flaw, but as a symptom of a deeper split in the psyche, a disconnection from what he called the self, that wise, integrated center of our being that knows how to love without losing itself, how to give without depleting its own well. The journey toward this integrated self often begins, paradoxically, with a kind of withdrawal, not from love itself, but from the unconscious patterns that masquerade as love while actually serving fear. This brings us to wonder about the transformative power of conscious unavailability. When Jung speaks of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, he's describing a journey that requires us to step back from the world's endless demands and listen instead to the quiet voice of our own psyche. This isn't the silence of depression or the withdrawal of trauma, though it may be mistaken for these things by those who benefit from our constant availability. This is the sacred silence of a soul learning to discern between what genuinely calls for its attention and what simply clamors for it. Settling deeper into the idea, you might recognize that every spiritual tradition speaks of this necessity for withdrawal. The hermit's cave, the monk's cell, the artist's studio, the writer's retreat. These aren't escapes from life, but preparations for deeper engagement. They're spaces where the authentic self can emerge from beneath the layers of social conditioning and unconscious reactivity. Jung himself underwent what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense inner exploration that required him to become largely unavailable to the outer world, while he mapped the territories of the psyche that would become his life's work. As we journey deeper tonight into Jung's understanding of this psychological transformation, you might find yourself wondering about your own patterns of availability and withdrawal. There's something soothing about following these thought paths without needing to reach any immediate conclusions, allowing Jung's insights to settle into your awareness like sediment in still water. Perhaps by morning, you'll have discovered something new about the delicate balance between genuine service and unconscious self-sacrifice, between healthy solitude and painful isolation. The wise psyche, Jung believed, naturally moves toward wholeness when we stop interfering with its organic processes. Just as a garden grows best when we know when to tend it and when to leave it alone, our psychological development flourishes when we learn the art of conscious unavailability, creating space for our authentic nature to emerge without the constant pressure to perform, please, or prove our worth through endless giving. To truly understand how Jung arrived at these revolutionary insights about the healing power of withdrawal, we need to first step back into his world, the rapidly changing landscape of early 20th century Europe, where the very foundations of human understanding were shifting beneath everyone's feet. Let's allow ourselves to drift back to that time and place, where a young psychiatrist was beginning to question everything he'd been taught about the human mind, and discovering that sometimes the most profound healing begins when we stop trying so hard to be helpful to everyone else. This understanding opens a doorway to the world that shaped Jung's revolutionary insights, a world where the very foundations of human knowledge were shifting like tectonic plates beneath the feet of anyone brave enough to question what had always been taken for granted. As these thoughts about withdrawal and authenticity settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves drifting back through time itself, back to a moment when one man's willingness to become unavailable to conventional thinking would change our understanding of the human psyche forever. Picture yourself stepping through the gaslit streets of Zurich in the early 1900s, where the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones mingles with the distant whistle of steam trains, carrying new ideas across a rapidly changing Europe. The air carries the scent of coal smoke and fresh bread from the bakeries, mixed with the crisp mountain air that flows down from the Swiss Alps. You can feel the texture of worn stone beneath your feet as you walk toward the imposing gray walls of the Burghölzli Hospital, where a young Carl Jung is about to discover that the human mind contains mysteries far deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. It's 1900, and Jung is just 25 years old, standing at the threshold of his career as a psychiatrist. The gas lamps flicker in the hospital corridors, casting dancing shadows that seem almost alive, an ironic foreshadowing of what Jung would later understand about the autonomous life of the unconscious mind. As you walk beside him down these institutional hallways, you notice the smell of carbolic acid and starched linens, the soft rustle of nurses' uniforms, and the muffled sounds of humans suffering behind closed doors. These are not just the sounds of illness, Jung is beginning to realize, but the voices of Psyche is crying out for understanding in a world that has learned to silence what it cannot explain. Imagine Jung in his small office, the morning light filtering through tall windows as he sits across from patients whose inner worlds have been dismissed as meaningless chaos by the psychiatric establishment of his time. His desk is cluttered with papers filled with word associations, seemingly random responses that he's beginning to recognize as anything but random. The scratch of his pen on paper creates a rhythm like meditation, as he documents each patient's responses, each pause, each moment of emotional charge that reveals the existence of what he would later call complexes, those autonomous clusters of emotions and memories that live their own lives within the psyche. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself, those moments when a particular word or phrase triggers an unexpected flood of emotion, when something seemingly innocent touches a nerve you didn't know was exposed. Jung was witnessing this phenomenon systematically, mapping the hidden landscapes of the human mind with the patience of a cartographer exploring uncharted territory. His word association tests revealed that beneath the surface of rational consciousness lay entire continents of feeling and memory, operating according to their own mysterious logic. As you settle deeper into this historical moment, you might notice how Jung's willingness to become unavailable to the accepted theories of his time was itself a kind of individuation, a withdrawal from the collective assumptions of his profession in order to listen more carefully to what his patients were actually telling him. The psychiatric textbooks of 1900 spoke of mental illness in terms of degeneracy and moral weakness, but Jung was hearing something entirely different in the voices of those who had been labeled insane. He was hearing the psyche's attempt to heal itself, to speak its truth, even when that truth emerged in the fragmented language of symptoms and delusions. This naturally raises the question of what it means to truly listen, not just to the words someone speaks, but to the deeper currents of meaning that flow beneath conscious expression. Jung was developing what we might call the art of unavailability to surface interpretations, creating space for deeper truths to emerge. Just as you might need to step away from a noisy street to hear the subtle sound of water flowing underground, Jung was learning to withdraw his attention from the obvious explanations in order to perceive the hidden patterns that would revolutionize our understanding of the human mind. Picture Jung in his study late at night, the gaslight flickering as he writes in his journal about the strange dreams his patients have been sharing with him. The room is quiet except for the ticking of a clock and the occasional sound of wind rattling the windows, and in this solitude, he begins to notice something remarkable. The same symbolic images keep appearing in dream after dream, told by patients who have never met each other, who come from different backgrounds and have no shared cultural references. There's something in the human psyche, he realizes, that transcends individual experience, a deeper layer of consciousness that connects all humanity through shared patterns and symbols. This is the moment when Jung's concept of the collective unconscious begins to emerge, born from his willingness to remain available to mystery, while becoming unavailable to the reductive explanations that satisfied his colleagues. The scent of pipe tobacco fills his study as he contemplates this possibility, and you can almost feel the excitement building in his chest as he realizes he's standing at the edge of a discovery that will change everything. But this excitement is tempered by a profound loneliness, for he knows that this path of exploration will require him to become increasingly unavailable to the approval of his medical peers. As you drift alongside Jung through these formative years, you might recognize the courage it takes to pursue understanding that leads away from the safety of conventional wisdom. This is the same courage required in our own lives when we choose to become unavailable to relationships or situations that demand we abandon our authentic perceptions in favor of what others need us to believe. Jung was learning that truth-seeking often requires a kind of sacred isolation, a willingness to sit with uncertainty and complexity rather than rushing toward the comfort of premature conclusions. Following this thread deeper into Jung's developing understanding, we find him beginning to question even his mentor Sigmund Freud's revolutionary theories about the unconscious mind. Picture their famous walks together along the shores of Lake Zurich, two brilliant minds grappling with the deepest questions about human nature, while the gentle lapping of water provides a rhythmic background to their intense conversations. Jung's growing conviction that the psyche contains spiritual dimensions that cannot be reduced to sexual drives is creating a rift between them that will eventually require Jung to make a choice between intellectual honesty and professional security. The texture of this conflict might feel familiar to anyone who has faced the decision to honor their own inner knowing, even when it means disappointing someone whose approval they value. Jung's willingness to become unavailable to Freud's theoretical framework, even at the cost of their relationship, demonstrates the kind of psychological courage that individuation requires. It's 1913, and as Jung sits in that study we visited earlier, writing in his red book and exploring the depths of his own unconscious, He's living the very principles he would later teach about the necessity of withdrawing from external authorities in order to discover one's own authentic relationship with truth. Interestingly, this period of professional isolation coincides with Jung's most creative and productive phase, as if his unavailability to the demands of his former theoretical allegiances freed up psychic energy for genuine discovery. The gaslight flickers across pages filled with vivid drawings and symbolic imagery flowing from his own unconscious, and you can sense the profound satisfaction that comes from finally being available to one's own authentic vision, rather than trying to fit that vision into someone else's framework. This is the paradox that Jung would spend his lifetime exploring: how withdrawal from false connections creates space for true connection to emerge. As these historical images begin to dissolve and reform in your drowsy awareness, you might notice how Jung's personal journey of becoming unavailable to external validation mirrors the very process he would later map as individuation. His willingness to sit with uncertainty, to explore the depths of his own psyche during this period of professional exile, was preparing him to understand the architecture of the human mind in ways that would benefit countless future generations. The courage to become temporarily unavailable to the world's expectations was, paradoxically, what allowed him to offer his most valuable gifts to humanity. This brings us to wonder about the deeper structures Jung was discovering within the psyche itself, those mysterious territories of consciousness and unconsciousness that operate according to their own timeless logic, generating the very patterns of availability and withdrawal that shape our most important relationships and creative endeavors. Following this thread deeper into Jung's revolutionary understanding, we find ourselves standing before what might be imagined as a vast, luminous mansion of the mind, with rooms both familiar and strange, corridors that lead to unexpected discoveries, and depths that extend far beyond what any single lifetime could fully explore. Picture yourself walking through this mansion of consciousness on a quiet evening, where the soft glow of lamplight reveals the intricate architecture Jung mapped so carefully throughout his lifetime. The first floor, bright and welcoming, represents what he called the conscious mind, the space where you're currently aware of your thoughts, the comfortable living room of your daily experience where familiar furniture holds the memories and concerns you can easily access. The warmth of this space feels reassuring, filled with the scent of books and the gentle ticking of a mantel clock. But as you move through these well-lit rooms, you begin to notice doorways leading to dimmer spaces, staircases descending into shadows that seem to hold their own quiet intelligence. At the center of this conscious realm sits what Jung termed the ego, not the inflated sense of self-importance we sometimes associate with that word, but something far more essential and humble. The ego is simply the organizing principle of your awareness, the I that experiences, remembers, and chooses in each moment. Imagine it as the steady flame of a candle, providing just enough light to illuminate the immediate surroundings while remaining aware that vast darkness stretches beyond its reach. This flame of consciousness flickers with each thought and sensation, creating the continuity of experience that allows you to recognize yourself as the same person who woke up this morning, who remembers yesterday's conversations, who plans tomorrow's activities. Yet as Jung discovered through years of careful observation, this conscious ego represents only a small fraction of the total psyche, perhaps like a single lit window in a vast apartment building at night, where countless other rooms exist in varying degrees of darkness and illumination. The limitations of consciousness become apparent when you consider how much of your mental life operates outside your immediate awareness. the way you breathe without thinking, how solutions to problems sometimes arrive unbidden in the shower, the mysterious process by which dreams weave together fragments of experience into strange new narratives while you sleep. Descending the staircase from this brightly lit conscious realm, you enter what Jung called the personal unconscious, a vast library of your individual experience where the books have been stored but temporarily forgotten. The air here carries the faint scent of old photographs and childhood memories, and the soft rustle of pages turning themselves in the gentle breeze of passing thoughts. These are the rooms where your psyche keeps everything that has slipped below the threshold of immediate awareness. The name of your third-grade teacher that will surface unexpectedly years later. The hurt feelings from last month's misunderstanding that still influence your mood in subtle ways. The buried dreams and abandoned projects that continue to pulse with their own quiet life. Perhaps you've experienced this realm during those moments when a particular song transports you instantly to a specific time and place, bringing with it not just visual memories, but the complete sensory atmosphere of that experience. The temperature of the air, the quality of light, even the emotional texture of who you were in that moment. Jung understood that these personal unconscious contents don't simply lie dormant like files in a cabinet. They organize themselves into what he called complexes, those emotionally charged clusters of memory and association that can influence our behavior from beneath the surface of awareness. Think of these complexes as autonomous subpersonalities within the psyche, each with its own agenda and emotional charge. You might recognize the worried parent complex that activates whenever your children are late coming home, or the abandoned child complex that emerges when someone you care about seems distant or preoccupied. These patterns operate with their own intelligence, gathering related experiences around them like magnets collecting metal filings, creating those moments when your reaction to a situation seems disproportionate to what's actually happening in the present moment. But Jung's most profound discovery lay deeper still, in what he termed the collective unconscious, a realm that extends far beyond personal experience into the shared inheritance of all humanity. Imagine descending another level in this mansion of the mind, where the personal photographs and mementos give way to ancient symbols and universal stories that somehow feel intimately familiar despite their timeless quality. The air here shimmers with a different energy, thick with the wisdom of countless generations, filled with the archetypal patterns that have guided human experience since consciousness first emerged from the primordial darkness. What if you could sense, in your quieter moments, the presence of this deeper layer, not as an abstract concept, but as a living reality that connects you to every human being who has ever wondered about love, death, meaning, transformation? Jung found evidence for this collective inheritance in the dreams of his patients, where symbols appeared that echoed myths and fairy tales from cultures the dreamers had never encountered. A modern businessman would dream of crossing a dangerous bridge guarded by a serpent, unknowingly recapitulating the hero's journey that has structured human stories for millennia. This naturally raises the question of what it means to discover that your individual psyche is rooted in something vast and transpersonal. As you contemplate this possibility, drifting through these deeper chambers of consciousness, you might notice how it changes your relationship to your own struggles and symptoms. That anxiety about stepping into unknown territory begins to feel connected to the universal human experience of leaving the familiar behind. The depression that follows a major life transition echoes the archetypal pattern of death and rebirth that every spiritual tradition recognizes as essential to growth and transformation. Jung realized that healing often involves helping people recognize their personal experiences as variations on these timeless themes, connecting the isolation of individual suffering to the larger human story. Put differently, when you understand that your challenges are not unique personal failures, but participation in the eternal human journey toward wholeness, something in the psyche seems to relax and open, like a tightly closed fist slowly uncurling in warm water. Interestingly, this three-tiered model of the psyche, conscious, personal unconscious, and collective unconscious, operates as a self-regulating system, constantly seeking balance and wholeness through what Jung called compensation. When consciousness becomes too one-sided, too identified with a particular attitude or approach, the unconscious responds by producing dreams, symptoms, or experiences that attempt to restore equilibrium. Perhaps you've noticed this in your own life. Periods of intense intellectual focus followed by inexplicable cravings for physical activity or emotional expression. Or times when your most rational plans are disrupted by seemingly random events that force you to consider alternatives you hadn't previously imagined. This compensatory function suggests that the psyche possesses its own wisdom about what's needed for healthy development, even when that wisdom conflicts with conscious intentions or social expectations. The depression that forces a workaholic to slow down, the anxiety that prevents someone from making a decision they're not truly ready for, the recurring dream that won't be ignored. All of these can be understood as the psyche's attempt to guide consciousness toward greater wholeness and authenticity. As these layers of understanding begin to dissolve and reform in your drowsy awareness, you might sense how Jung's model illuminates the very dynamics of availability and withdrawal we've been exploring. The conscious ego, in its desire to maintain control and social acceptance, often becomes overly available to external demands while losing touch with the deeper currents of wisdom flowing from the unconscious realms. The journey toward authentic selfhood requires learning to become available to these inner voices, even when they guide us away from what others expect or approve of. This brings us to wonder about the mysterious force that animates this entire system, the energy that flows between conscious and unconscious, the life force that drives the psyche's constant movement toward balance and integration, and how understanding this energy might transform our relationship to the very patterns of depletion and renewal that govern our daily experience, knowing exactly where it needs to go. This flowing water becomes a perfect metaphor for what Jung called libido, not the narrow sexual energy that Freud had described, but something far more encompassing and profound. The total life force that animates every aspect of human experience, from our most basic survival instincts to our highest creative and spiritual aspirations. Jung's revolutionary insight was recognizing that this psychic energy operates with the same natural laws that govern physical energy. It cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed and redirected. Just as the mountain stream carries nutrients from the peaks down to the valleys where they nourish new growth, the libido flows through the psyche, carrying the essential vitality needed for psychological development and healing. When this energy flows freely and in its natural direction, we experience what we might call psychological health, a sense of purpose and meaning, the capacity for genuine relationships, creative expression, and that ineffable feeling of being alive and engaged with life itself. Perhaps you've experienced moments when this energy seemed to flow effortlessly through your being, those times when work felt like play, when relationships deepened without effort, when solutions to problems seemed to arise spontaneously from some inner wellspring of wisdom. The texture of these experiences often includes a particular quality of presence, as if you were completely available to the moment without the usual internal resistance or commentary. There's often a sense of time expanding or dissolving, the way it does during particularly absorbing conversations, or when you're completely immersed in an activity that calls forth your natural talents and interests. What if we could understand these peak experiences not as random occurrences, but as glimpses of what becomes possible when the libido flows in alignment with the psyche's deepest purposes? Jung discovered that this life energy has what he called a natural penchant, an inherent direction or wisdom about where it wants to flow. Like water finding its way to the sea, the libido naturally moves toward what serves the total development of the personality, often in ways that confound the conscious mind's more limited agenda of safety, control, and social approval. This naturally raises questions about what happens when this vital energy becomes blocked, dammed up, or forced to flow in directions that violate its essential nature. Picture that same mountain stream encountering a beaver dam or human-made obstruction, where the water begins to pool and stagnate behind the barrier, losing its sparkle and movement. In the psyche, these obstructions often take the form of rigid beliefs about who we should be, inherited family patterns that demand we sacrifice our authentic nature for the sake of belonging, or traumatic experiences that teach us to shut down our natural responses to life in order to survive overwhelming circumstances. Jung observed that many of the symptoms his patients brought to him, depression, anxiety, compulsive behaviors, a persistent sense of meaninglessness, could be understood as manifestations of libidinal blockage or misdirection. Depression, in particular, often represents a state where the life energy has become so dammed up that it can no longer flow toward any meaningful goal or relationship. The person feels stuck, listless, disconnected from their own vitality, as if the internal spring that once nourished their engagement with life has somehow dried up or been diverted underground where it can no longer be accessed. Conversely, what we might call mania or excessive anxiety can represent the opposite extreme, psychic energy that has been suddenly released from constraint but lacks proper channels for expression, like a river during flood season that overflows its banks and creates chaos rather than nourishment. In both cases, Jung understood that healing involves helping the person rediscover the natural pathways through which their life energy wants to flow, removing the internal obstacles that have disrupted this organic process. As you drift deeper into this understanding, you might notice how it illuminates the very patterns of availability and withdrawal we've been exploring throughout this journey. When we become endlessly available to external demands while ignoring the subtle signals from our own inner life, we're essentially forcing our libido to flow against its natural current. The exhaustion, resentment, and spiritual emptiness that often result from chronic people-pleasing can be understood as symptoms of energetic misdirection, like trying to make a river flow uphill through sheer force of will. The wisdom of strategic unavailability, from this perspective, becomes not just a boundary-setting technique, but a way of removing the artificial dams that prevent our life energy from flowing toward its authentic destinations. When we stop being available to what drains us, we create space for discovering what truly nourishes and energizes us. This is why periods of withdrawal often precede creative breakthroughs, spiritual insights, or the courage to make necessary life changes. They provide the psychic space needed for the libido to find its natural course again. Interestingly, Jung discovered that this life energy seems to possess an intelligence that transcends the ego's conscious understanding. The unconscious communicates the libido's true direction through dreams, fantasies, physical symptoms, and those mysterious synchronicities that seem to guide us toward exactly what we need, often through paths we never would have chosen consciously. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself, those moments when following an inexplicable impulse or honoring an irrational feeling led to exactly the opportunity, relationship, or insight that your deeper development required. This suggests that one of the most important skills for psychological health involves learning to read the subtle signals through which the psyche communicates its deeper needs and directions. The chronic headache that appears every time you consider taking a job that pays well but deadens your spirit might be the libido's way of saying, "This path leads away from life." The unexpected surge of energy you feel when engaging in a particular activity or conversation might be pointing toward some aspect of your authentic nature that wants to emerge more fully into expression. As these thoughts begin to dissolve and reform in your drowsy awareness, you might sense how this understanding of psychic energy transforms the entire question of personal growth and self-discovery. Rather than seeing development as something we must force or manufacture through effort and discipline, Jung's vision suggests that we are all guided by an inner wisdom that naturally moves toward wholeness and integration when we learn to recognize and trust its signals. The art becomes not one of pushing ourselves towards some ideal of who we should be, but of removing the obstacles that prevent us from becoming who we already are in our deepest essence. Put differently, the journey toward authenticity involves learning to distinguish between the ego's agenda of maintaining safety and control and the self's agenda of realizing our complete potential as human beings. This discernment requires a kind of inner listening that can only develop in the quiet spaces we create through conscious unavailability to the world's constant demands for our attention and energy. This understanding opens a doorway to perhaps the most profound question Jung grappled with throughout his lifetime. What is the ultimate purpose toward which this intelligent life energy flows? And how might recognizing this purpose transform not only our individual lives, but our understanding of what it means to be fully human? As these thoughts about psychic energy settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves approaching the heart of Jung's revolutionary insight. That buried within every human psyche lies an organizing principle so fundamental, so mysteriously wise, that it guides us throughout our entire lifetime toward becoming the complete, authentic individuals we were always meant to be. Picture yourself walking through an ancient forest at dawn, where shafts of golden sunlight filter through the canopy above, illuminating a path that seems to wind deeper into the heart of some great mystery. The air is cool against your skin and filled with the earthy scent of moss and fallen leaves, while the soft sound of your footsteps on the forest floor mingles with the distant call of birds greeting the new day. As you walk this winding path, you begin to notice how each tree around you has grown according to its own unique pattern, some reaching straight toward the light, others growing in spirals or bending around obstacles, yet each somehow expressing the complete potential that was always contained within its original seed. This forest becomes a living metaphor for what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process through which the psyche naturally unfolds toward its own unique form of wholeness and completion. Just as each tree must navigate the particular conditions of its environment while remaining true to its essential nature, each human being faces the challenge of developing their authentic self within the complex web of family, culture, and circumstance that shapes their early years. The path of individuation is neither straight nor predictable, yet it carries within it the same intelligence that guides the oak to become fully oak the pine to express its essential pineness, and the willow to discover its own graceful way of being in the world. Imagine Jung sitting in his study on a quiet evening in 1930, the warm glow of lamplight reflecting off the pages of his journal as he struggles to find words for what he's been observing in both his patients and himself. The scratch of his pen on paper creates a meditative rhythm. As he writes about this mysterious process he's beginning to understand as the central organizing principle of human psychological development. He notices how his most successful therapeutic work seems to happen when he stops trying to cure symptoms and instead helps people reconnect with their own inner direction, that subtle but persistent pull toward becoming more genuinely themselves. Perhaps you felt this pull in your own quieter moments, that sense of being called towards something you can't quite name, a feeling that there's more to you than the roles you play and the image you present to the world. It might emerge as a restless dissatisfaction with a life that looks successful from the outside, but feels somehow hollow within, or as a sudden clarity about what you no longer want to tolerate in your relationships and circumstances. Sometimes this inner calling announces itself through dreams that persist in memory long after waking, or through those moments of unexpected emotion when something beautiful or meaningful touches a place in you that rarely gets acknowledged in daily life. Jung discovered that this process of becoming yourself is fundamentally dialectical, meaning it unfolds through the creative tension between opposing forces within the psyche. Picture this inner dynamic as a spiral dance between consciousness and the unconscious, between the known and unknown aspects of yourself, between the parts of you that seek safety and belonging and the parts that hunger for growth and authentic expression. The ego, which we explored earlier as the organizing center of conscious awareness, must learn to engage in ongoing dialogue with the deeper, wiser self that encompasses the total potential of your being. This naturally raises questions about what it means to live from this deeper center rather than from the smaller, more familiar territory of ego consciousness. The ego is essential for navigating daily life. It's what allows you to maintain relationships, hold a job, make decisions, and function effectively in the world. But the ego becomes problematic when it mistakes itself for the whole of your identity, when it tries to maintain control by keeping certain aspects of your nature locked away in the unconscious, where they can't threaten its sense of stability and predictability. As you contemplate this possibility while drifting deeper along our philosophical path, you might notice how the journey toward authentic selfhood often begins with a kind of crisis or disruption, what Jung sometimes called the wounding of the personality. This might take the form of a major life transition, the end of an important relationship, a career disappointment, or simply that gradual accumulation of awareness that the life you've been living doesn't quite fit the person you're becoming. These disruptions, while often painful, serve an essential function. They force attention away from the external world and toward the inner landscape where the real work of becoming yourself must take place. Interestingly, Jung observed that this process unfolds differently in the two halves of life. The first half, roughly from birth through the late 30s or early 40s, is primarily concerned with what we might call ego development, building a functional personality, establishing your place in the world, developing competence and relationships, accumulating the experiences and skills needed to navigate adult life successfully. This is the time when a certain amount of conformity and adaptation serves healthy development, when learning to meet social expectations and external demands provides essential structure for growing into maturity. But somewhere around midlife, a different task begins to emerge. The external achievements that once felt so important may start to seem less compelling, and questions about meaning, purpose, and authenticity begin to demand attention in new ways. This is when the second half of life's task becomes clear. The conscious exploration of your inner world, the integration of previously rejected aspects of yourself, and the gradual alignment of your outer life with the deeper truth of who you are beyond all the roles and identities you've accumulated. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a still mountain lake at twilight, where the surface of the water perfectly reflects the sky above, creating the momentary illusion that you're suspended between two infinite expanses of space. This image captures something essential about what Jung meant by the realization of the self, that moment when the boundary between inner and outer, conscious and unconscious, individual and universal, begins to dissolve into a larger sense of wholeness and connection. The self, in Jung's understanding, is both the center of your individual psyche and your connection to something transpersonal and eternal. You might recognize glimpses of this integrated state in those rare moments when everything seems to align, when your actions flow naturally from your deepest values, when you feel simultaneously completely yourself and completely connected to life itself. These might occur during intense creative work, in moments of deep intimacy, in experiences of natural beauty, or in those quiet periods when meditation or reflection opens a space of profound inner stillness. There's often a quality of effortlessness to these experiences, as if you've temporarily stepped out of the struggle to be someone and into the grace of simply being. Following this thread deeper into Jung's understanding, we discover that individuation is not a selfish or narcissistic process, despite how it might initially appear to a culture that often confuses conformity with caring. The person who has done the difficult work of becoming authentically themselves actually becomes more available for genuine relationship and service, not less. When you no longer need to use others to fill the gaps in your own identity or to validate your worth, you can meet them as they actually are rather than as projections of your own unconscious needs and fears. Put differently, the courage to become unavailable to what diminishes you creates space for true availability to what calls forth your gifts and deepest capacities for love. This is why Jung saw individuation not as a luxury for the privileged few, but as an essential task for anyone who wants to contribute something meaningful to the healing and evolution of human consciousness. Each person who does the work of integrating their own shadows and developing their authentic gifts becomes a bridge between the personal and transpersonal, the individual and collective dimensions of existence. As these insights begin to settle into your awareness like gentle rain soaking into fertile soil, you might sense how this understanding transforms the entire question of personal development and spiritual growth. Rather than seeking to become someone other than who you are, individuation invites you to discover and express who you have always been beneath the layers of conditioning, expectation, and adaptation that have accumulated over the years. This brings us to wonder about the specific challenges and opportunities that arise as we attempt to embody this authentic selfhood in our actual relationships and circumstances, particularly those moments when being true to ourselves seems to conflict with what others expect or need from us. Following this thread deeper into the territory of human connection, we discover that some of the most intense reactions we have to other people often reveal something profound about the hidden aspects of ourselves, those parts of our nature that we've learned to disown, but that continue to live and breathe in the shadows of our awareness, influencing our relationships in ways we rarely recognize. Picture yourself walking through a moonlit garden where every familiar flower and tree casts mysterious shadows that seem to move and shift with a life of their own. The cool night air carries the fragrance of jasmine and roses, while the soft crunch of gravel beneath your feet provides a rhythm for your gentle exploration of this shadowy landscape. As you move deeper into the garden, you begin to notice that some of these shadows seem strangely familiar, as if they're cast not by the plants around you, but by aspects of yourself that you've never quite acknowledged. Qualities and impulses that live just outside the circle of light that represents your conscious self-understanding. This garden of shadows becomes a living metaphor for what Jung called the shadow archetype. That part of the personality which contains all the human qualities and potentials that we've learned to see as unacceptable, dangerous, or simply incompatible with the image we want to maintain of ourselves. The shadow is formed through a natural and necessary process that begins in early childhood, when we learn to distinguish between behaviors that earn approval and belonging and those that result in rejection or punishment. The loving smile when we share our toys gets reinforced, while the angry outburst when someone takes them gets quickly discouraged. Perhaps you can remember moments from your own childhood when certain aspects of your natural personality, your anger, your sadness, your wild creativity, or even your quiet sensitivity, were met with disapproval or discomfort from the adults around you. In order to maintain the essential connection to our caregivers, we learn to push these rejected qualities out of conscious awareness, not because they disappear, but because they go underground, forming what Jung recognized as a kind of autonomous subpersonality that continues to develop in the darkness of the unconscious mind. Imagine Jung in his consulting room, observing with fascination how his patients would become most animated and emotionally charged when describing the faults and irritating qualities of other people in their lives. The woman who complained endlessly about her neighbor's selfishness seemed blind to her own capacity for self-centeredness, while the man who raged about his colleagues' dishonesty appeared unaware of the small deceptions that characterized his own daily interactions. Jung began to recognize that these intense emotional reactions often functioned like spotlights, illuminating in others the very qualities that lived in the shadow of the observer's own psyche. This psychological mechanism that Jung called projection operates like an unconscious magic trick. We take aspects of ourselves that we cannot or will not acknowledge and experience them as belonging to someone else entirely. It's as if the psyche has its own built-in movie projector that displays our internal content on the screen of other people's personalities, allowing us to see and react to our own disowned qualities while maintaining the illusion that they have nothing to do with us. The colleague who makes us feel inadequate might be carrying the projection of our own inner critic, while the friend whose neediness irritates us could be reflecting our own unacknowledged hunger for attention and care. You might recognize this dynamic in your own experience. Those people who trigger an immediate and seemingly disproportionate emotional response, where something about their personality feels like fingernails on a chalkboard to your nervous system. Interestingly, these strong reactions often provide valuable information about the contents of your own shadow, pointing toward aspects of yourself that might benefit from conscious acknowledgement and integration rather than continued denial and projection. As you contemplate this possibility while drifting through our moonlit garden of self-discovery, you might notice how liberating it could be to withdraw these projections and reclaim these disowned parts of yourself. This doesn't mean acting out every impulse or embracing behaviors that are genuinely harmful, but rather developing a more complete and honest relationship with the full spectrum of your human nature. When you can acknowledge your own capacity for selfishness, dishonesty, or aggression, you paradoxically become less likely to be unconsciously controlled by these qualities and more capable of conscious choice about how and when to express them. The process of shadow integration involves what Jung called making the darkness conscious, a phrase that captures both the difficulty and the profound value of this inner work. Picture yourself in that moonlit garden, gradually approaching one of those familiar yet strange shadows with curiosity rather than fear. As you draw closer, the shadow begins to reveal itself not as some monstrous enemy, but as an aspect of yourself that has been waiting patiently for acknowledgement and acceptance. There's often something both humbling and oddly comforting about these encounters with our own darkness. Humbling, because they require us to release our cherished self-images, and comforting because they end the exhausting work of maintaining psychological defenses against parts of ourselves. Curiously, Jung discovered that the shadow contains not only the qualities we consider negative, but also positive potentials that we've learned to see as dangerous or inappropriate. The person who grew up in a family that valued intellectual achievement might have a shadow that contains their natural artistic creativity, while someone raised to be perpetually helpful and accommodating might have disowned their healthy capacity for assertiveness and boundary setting. In a culture that often encourages conformity and emotional restraint, many people's shadows contain their authentic passion, their wild creativity, their spiritual longings, or their capacity for deep feeling. This naturally raises questions about what becomes possible when we begin to reclaim these exiled aspects of ourselves. As you settle deeper into this understanding, you might sense how shadow integration transforms not only our relationship with ourselves, but our capacity for genuine intimacy with others. When we're no longer unconsciously defending against our own darkness, we become less threatened by the imperfections and complexities we encounter in other people. We can meet them with the kind of compassionate realism that recognizes our shared humanity, rather than the idealization or demonization that characterizes relationships based on projection. Perhaps you've experienced moments of this kind of authentic connection, those conversations where both people can acknowledge their struggles and limitations without shame, where there's room for the full spectrum of human experience rather than just the socially acceptable portions. These encounters often carry a particular quality of relief and recognition, as if both parties have been granted permission to set down the exhausting work of seeming perfect and simply be human together. Interestingly, this work of shadow integration directly illuminates the dynamics of availability and withdrawal that we've been exploring throughout our journey. When we're unconsciously driven by the need to maintain a certain image of ourselves, we often become overly available to relationships and situations that reinforce our preferred self-concept, while becoming unavailable to experiences that might challenge or expand it. The person whose shadow contains their anger might become endlessly available to people who need caretaking, while remaining unavailable to situations that would require them to assert their own needs or set firm boundaries. Put differently, strategic unavailability sometimes means becoming unavailable to the roles and relationships that keep us trapped in a partial version of ourselves, creating space for the fuller, more complex person we actually are to emerge into expression. This kind of withdrawal from false connection creates the possibility for authentic intimacy, relationships where all aspects of our nature can be gradually revealed and accepted rather than hidden away in the shadows of shame and fear. As these insights begin to settle into your awareness like gentle moonlight illuminating previously hidden corners of the garden, you might sense how this understanding of projection and shadow work transforms our approach to the most challenging relationships in our lives. Rather than seeing difficult people merely as obstacles to our peace and happiness, we can begin to recognize them as unconscious teachers, reflecting back aspects of ourselves that are seeking integration and wholeness. This brings us to wonder about the larger patterns and universal themes that seem to operate beneath the surface of all human relationships. Those timeless dynamics that Jung discovered transcend individual personality and connect us to the collective story of what it means to be human. This brings us to wonder about the larger patterns and universal themes that seem to operate beneath the surface of all human relationships. Those timeless dynamics that Jung discovered transcend individual personality and connect us to the collective story of what it means to be human. As these thoughts about projection and shadow work settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves approaching one of Jung's most profound and mysterious discoveries. That buried within the deepest layers of human consciousness lie ancient patterns of experience, universal templates that have guided our species through love, loss, transformation, and the search for meaning since consciousness first emerged from the primordial darkness of our evolutionary past. Picture yourself standing in a vast library that exists not in any physical building, but in the depths of collective human memory, a repository of wisdom that belongs to no single culture or time period, but somehow contains the essential stories that every civilization has told itself about the nature of existence. The air here shimmers with an otherworldly quality, thick with the accumulated dreams and visions of countless generations, while soft whispers seem to echo from the towering shelves that stretch beyond the reach of vision. As you move through this luminous space, you begin to sense that the books around you are not separate volumes, but variations on eternal themes, different expressions of the same fundamental patterns that have shaped human experience across all of history. This mystical library becomes a metaphor for what Jung called the collective unconscious, that deepest layer of the psyche that we share not as individuals, but as members of the human species. Unlike the personal unconscious, which contains the forgotten experiences of your individual life, the collective unconscious holds the inherited patterns of human experience that have been repeated so many times across so many generations that they've become encoded in the very structure of consciousness itself. These patterns, which Jung termed archetypes, operate like invisible templates that predispose us to experience certain aspects of life in universally recognizable ways. Imagine Jung in his study during the winter of 1912, surrounded by stacks of books on mythology, religion, and anthropology, while outside his window the snow falls silently on the streets of Zurich. The warm glow of his desk lamp illuminates pages filled with images and stories from cultures that had no contact with one another, yet somehow told remarkably similar tales. The heroes journey into darkness and return with wisdom, the wise old man who appears at crucial moments to offer guidance, the great mother who nurtures and devours, the divine child who represents new possibilities. The scratch of his pen creates a meditative rhythm as he documents these recurring patterns, beginning to understand that he's discovered something far more significant than coincidence. Perhaps you've noticed these universal patterns in your own experience, those moments when life seems to be following a script written long before you were born. The period of transition when everything familiar falls away might echo the archetypal pattern of death and rebirth that appears in every spiritual tradition. The unexpected encounter with someone who offers exactly the wisdom you need might activate the archetype of the wise guide or mentor. The overwhelming love you feel when holding a newborn child might connect you to the primordial pattern of the nurturing parent that has ensured the survival of our species for millennia. These archetypal experiences often carry a particular quality of significance that transcends their immediate circumstances, a sense that you're participating in something larger than your individual story, touching something eternal and meaningful that connects you to the broader human experience. There's often a feeling of recognition, as if you're remembering something you've always known but had temporarily forgotten, a sense of homecoming to patterns that feel both ancient and intimately familiar. Following this thread deeper into Jung's understanding, we discover that archetypes function not as rigid formulas, but as living energies that seek expression through our individual lives and relationships. Think of them as magnetic fields of meaning that organize experience around certain central themes: love, power, wisdom, transformation, death, rebirth, drawing events and encounters toward them in ways that often seem mysteriously orchestrated. The person going through a major life transition might find themselves repeatedly encountering stories, people, and situations that reflect the archetypal pattern of the hero's journey, as if the psyche is gathering support and guidance for the transformation that's unfolding. Curiously, these archetypal patterns often become most visible during times of crisis or significant change, when the usual structures of life are disrupted and deeper currents of meaning begin to surface. The woman facing the end of a long marriage might find herself dreaming of ancient goddesses associated with independence and transformation, while the man confronting his own mortality might be visited by archetypal figures representing wisdom and spiritual transcendence. These images emerge not from personal memory, but from something far older and more universal: the collective wisdom of our species about how to navigate life's most fundamental challenges. This naturally raises questions about how recognizing these universal patterns might transform our understanding of personal suffering and growth. When you realize that your individual struggles are variations on themes that humans have been exploring for thousands of years, something in the psyche often relaxes into a larger sense of belonging and meaning. The isolation that can accompany difficult experiences begins to dissolve as you recognize your participation in the eternal human story of becoming, struggling, and ultimately finding wisdom through the navigation of life's inevitable challenges and transitions. As you contemplate this possibility while drifting through the luminous halls of our archetypal library, you might sense how this understanding illuminates the very dynamics of availability and withdrawal that we've been exploring throughout our journey. The patterns that make us vulnerable to manipulation and depletion often represent distorted expressions of archetypal energies. The caretaker who has lost touch with healthy boundaries might be unconsciously identified with the archetype of the nurturing mother, while the person who compulsively seeks approval might be driven by an unintegrated relationship with the archetype of the innocent child seeking love and protection. Put differently, becoming conscious of these archetypal influences allows us to relate to them more skillfully, drawing on their wisdom without being unconsciously possessed by their one-sided expression. The person who recognizes their connection to the nurturing mother archetype can learn to express care and compassion while maintaining healthy boundaries, while someone who understands their relationship to the innocent child can access wonder and openness without sacrificing their adult capacity for discernment and self-protection. Perhaps you've experienced moments when you felt connected to something larger than your individual personality, those times when you seemed to embody qualities or wisdom that felt like they came from beyond your personal knowledge and experience. These might occur during moments of creative inspiration, when caring for someone in need, during periods of deep contemplation, or in those sacred pauses when you feel connected to the mystery and beauty of existence itself. Jung understood these experiences as moments when the archetypal level of the psyche becomes active, allowing us to channel energies and wisdom that belong not just to us individually, but to the collective inheritance of our species. Interestingly, the process of individuation that we explored earlier can be understood as learning to develop a conscious relationship with these archetypal energies, neither rejecting them as primitive superstition nor being unconsciously controlled by them, but rather finding ways to honor their wisdom while maintaining our individual authenticity and freedom. This requires a kind of delicate balance, staying connected to the universal patterns that give life meaning, while remaining grounded in the particular circumstances and relationships that constitute our actual existence. As these insights begin to settle into your awareness like soft moonlight illuminating a familiar landscape from a new angle, you might sense how this understanding of archetypal patterns provides a larger context for all the inner work we've been exploring. The encounter with the shadow, the withdrawal of projections, the journey toward authentic selfhood. All of these individual processes can be seen as aspects of the greater archetypal pattern of transformation and awakening that has guided human development throughout history. This understanding opens a doorway to perhaps the most practical question of our entire exploration. How do we actually embody these insights in our daily lives, particularly in those challenging moments when we must choose between maintaining comfortable patterns of availability and embracing the sometimes difficult path of authentic self-expression? As these thoughts about archetypal patterns settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves approaching what might be the most delicate aspect of Jung's psychological map, the intricate dance between the authentic self that emerges through individuation and the social masks we wear to navigate the complex demands of family, work, and community life. Picture yourself standing before an ornate antique mirror in what appears to be a vast costume room, where hundreds of different masks and personas hang from elegant wooden stands, each representing a different role or identity you might choose to wear. The air carries the faint scent of old velvet and stage makeup, while soft light filters through tall windows, casting gentle shadows that seem to shift and dance as you move closer to your reflection. As you gaze into the mirror, you begin to notice something fascinating. Sometimes your reflection shows the face you're accustomed to seeing, but occasionally, for just a moment, you glimpse something deeper, more essential, as if the mirror were capable of showing not just your surface appearance, but the authentic self that lives beneath all the roles and expectations you've learned to embody. This costume room becomes a living metaphor for what Jung called the persona, that collection of social masks and adapted behaviors that we develop to function effectively in the external world. The word persona comes from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater, and Jung chose this etymology deliberately, recognizing that much of what we call personality is actually performance, a necessary adaptation to the social and cultural environment that shapes our early development. Like the actors of antiquity, we learn to embody different characters depending on the situation. The professional self we bring to work, the family member we become during holiday gatherings, the friend we are in different social circles. Imagine Jung in his consulting room during the 1920s, observing with growing fascination how many of his patients seem to have lost touch with any sense of who they were beneath their various social roles. The afternoon light streaming through his office, windows illuminates the concerned faces of successful professionals who could describe in great detail their accomplishments and responsibilities, but struggled to answer the simple question, what do you actually want from life? Well, the soft ticking of his desk clock provides a rhythm for their halting attempts to articulate feelings and desires that seem to have become buried beneath years of meeting external expectations and maintaining appropriate appearances. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself, those moments when you catch yourself responding automatically in ways that feel somehow foreign to your authentic nature, when you realize you've been saying what others want to hear rather than what you actually think or feel. There might be a particular quality of emptiness or disconnection that accompanies these interactions, as if you're watching yourself perform from a slight distance, going through the motions of engagement while your deeper self remains curiously absent from the exchange. Jung discovered that while a functional persona is essential for navigating social life successfully, problems arise when we become unconsciously identified with these roles, when the mask becomes so habitual that we forget we're wearing it. This over-identification with the persona creates what we might call a false self, a personality structure that looks convincing from the outside but lacks genuine substance, like a beautifully designed house that has no foundation. The person becomes all persona, living entirely through borrowed identities, while the authentic self remains undeveloped and unknown. Following this thread deeper into Jung's understanding, we begin to see how this dynamic directly illuminates the patterns of availability and withdrawal that we've been exploring throughout our journey. The person who has become over-identified with the persona often becomes compulsively available to any situation that reinforces their adapted identity, while becoming mysteriously unavailable to experiences that might threaten or challenge their carefully constructed image. The helpful caretaker cannot risk saying no, even when exhausted, because unavailability would contradict the role through which they've learned to find meaning and acceptance. This naturally raises questions about what happens when the persona begins to crack under the pressure of maintaining an identity that doesn't truly fit. Jung observed that many of his patients came to therapy during what he called the disintegration of the persona, those crisis periods when the social mask suddenly feels inadequate or inauthentic, when the old ways of being in the world no longer provide satisfaction or meaning. While these breakdowns are often experienced as catastrophic, Jung understood them as potentially healing crises, opportunities for the authentic self to emerge from beneath the layers of adaptation and performance. As you contemplate this possibility while drifting through our metaphorical costume room, you might notice how liberating it could feel to gradually loosen your attachment to the roles that no longer serve your authentic development. This doesn't mean abandoning all social adaptation or becoming carelessly self-centered, but rather developing what Jung called a flexible persona, the ability to wear appropriate social masks when necessary while remaining conscious that they are masks, maintaining access to the deeper self that exists independent of any particular role or identity. Picture yourself slowly removing some of the heavier, more constrictive costumes from your collection, keeping only those that feel genuinely aligned with your emerging sense of authentic purpose. There's often a particular relief that accompanies this process, like taking off shoes that have been pinching your feet all day, a sense of space and freedom that allows for more natural movement and expression. The energy that was previously devoted to maintaining inappropriate personas becomes available for more authentic forms of engagement and creativity. Interestingly, Jung discovered that as people learn to relate more consciously to their persona, They often become more skillful in their social interactions, not less. When you're no longer unconsciously identified with a particular role, you can choose more intentionally how to present yourself in different situations, drawing from your full range of authentic qualities rather than being limited to the narrow band of behaviors that a rigid persona allows. The naturally introverted person can learn to access their capacity for social warmth when appropriate without feeling like they're betraying their essential nature. This brings us to wonder about the relationship between persona work and the journey toward authentic availability, being genuinely present to life and relationships rather than performing presence from behind a mask. When you're no longer compulsively maintaining an image, you become available to respond more spontaneously and authentically to whatever life presents. The conversation that might have been filtered through the need to appear knowledgeable or helpful can instead become a genuine exchange between two authentic beings. Perhaps you've experienced moments of this kind of authentic presence, those interactions where you felt completely yourself, where there was no gap between who you were being and who you actually are. These encounters often carry a particular quality of ease and vitality, as if the energy that's usually spent maintaining appropriate appearances has been redirected toward genuine connection and creative response. Both people often leave such interactions feeling more alive and more themselves. Curiously, this work of developing a conscious relationship with the persona often requires what might seem like a paradox, becoming temporarily unavailable to the social expectations and roles that have defined you in order to discover what authentic availability might actually feel like. This might involve disappointing people who have become accustomed to a particular version of you, or saying no to opportunities that would reinforce an identity you're beginning to outgrow. While these choices can feel uncomfortable initially, they create space for more genuine forms of engagement to emerge. As these insights begin to settle into your awareness like warm sunlight dissolving the morning mist, you might sense how this understanding of persona work provides a bridge between the inner psychological transformation we've been exploring and the practical challenges of living authentically in relationship with others. The journey toward wholeness is not a purely internal process, but must eventually find expression in how we actually show up in our families, communities, and the wider world. This brings us to wonder about the specific challenges that arise when we begin to live more authentically, particularly those moments when our emerging genuineness seems to conflict with what others have come to expect from us, and how we might navigate these transitions with both courage and compassion. As these thoughts about persona work settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves approaching the most intimate territory of Jung's psychological landscape, where his century-old insights illuminate with startling clarity the modern struggles we face with boundaries, emotional exhaustion, and that peculiar form of self-betrayal that masquerades as love, but leaves us feeling depleted and resentful. Picture yourself walking through a beautiful garden that has been carefully designed to please every visitor who might pass through its gates. Roses planted in the colors that neighbors prefer. Pathways arranged to accommodate every possible walking style. Benches positioned to provide the exact view that each guest has mentioned enjoying. The morning air carries the mixed fragrances of a dozen different flower varieties, while the soft sound of gravel beneath your feet mingles with the gentle splash of a fountain, designed to create the perfect ambience for everyone who might stop to listen. Yet as you move through this seemingly perfect space, you begin to notice something troubling. There's no coherent vision holding it all together, no authentic expression of the gardener's own aesthetic sense. just an endless accommodation to external preferences that has created something technically beautiful but somehow soulless. This garden of endless accommodation becomes a living metaphor for the psychological pattern that Jung would recognize as the overdeveloped persona in service of what we now call people-pleasing. That compulsive need to be available to everyone's expectations, while remaining mysteriously unavailable to our own authentic needs and desires. In your own life, you might notice how this pattern manifests as the chronic difficulty saying no to requests that drain your energy. The way you find yourself agreeing to plans that don't actually interest you, or that peculiar form of emotional contortion where you consistently prioritize others' comfort over your own well-being, all while telling yourself that this is what love and generosity require. Imagine Jung observing this dynamic in his practice during the 1930s, watching patient after patient describe relationships that left them feeling simultaneously indispensable and invisible, valued for their service, but never quite seen for who they truly were. The warm afternoon light filtering through his office windows illuminates faces marked by a particular kind of exhaustion, not the tiredness that comes from meaningful work, but the depletion that results from constantly giving from an empty well, from trying to be everything to everyone while losing touch with their own authentic core. Perhaps you've experienced this exhaustion yourself, that bone-deep weariness that sleep doesn't seem to cure, the feeling of being simultaneously overcommitted and underappreciated. Jung understood this not as a character defect, but as a predictable consequence of what he called identification with the persona, where the social mask becomes so habitual that the person loses access to their own natural rhythms of engagement and withdrawal, their own organic sense of what nourishes them versus what depletes them. Following this thread deeper into Jung's understanding, we discover that this pattern of endless availability often serves as a defense against the very intimacy it appears to seek. When we become indispensable through constant service, we control how others relate to us, ensuring they need us while protecting ourselves from the vulnerability of being loved simply for who we are rather than what we do. The person who cannot say no often cannot say yes either, not to genuine intimacy, not to their own desires, not to the authentic connections that would require them to show up as themselves rather than as a provider of services. This naturally raises questions about what Jung called the withdrawal of projections, the process of recognizing that our compulsive availability often serves our own unconscious needs rather than the authentic well-being of others. As you contemplate this possibility while drifting through our metaphorical garden, you might notice how differently it would look if designed from genuine passion rather than the need to please, perhaps wild and slightly unruly in some corners, carefully structured in others, reflecting the authentic aesthetic sense of someone who knows their own preferences and isn't afraid to express them. The transformation from people-pleasing to authentic availability often begins with what might seem like a crisis, those moments when the old patterns suddenly feel impossible to maintain, when saying yes one more time feels like a betrayal of something essential within us. Jung understood these breaking points not as failures, but as opportunities for what he called the emergence of the self, those crucial moments when the deeper wisdom of the psyche asserts itself against the tyranny of endless accommodation. Picture yourself standing at the edge of that over-designed garden, holding a pair of pruning shears, and contemplating which elements truly belong and which exist only to satisfy others' preferences. There's often a particular kind of anxiety that accompanies this process, the fear of disappointing people, of being seen as selfish, of losing relationships that have been built on your availability rather than your authentic presence. Yet there's also something unmistakably liberating about the prospect of creating space for what genuinely wants to grow in the garden of your life. Interestingly, Jung discovered that people who learn to become consciously unavailable to what depletes them often become more genuinely available to what nourishes both themselves and others. When you're no longer giving from a sense of obligation or unconscious guilt, your generosity becomes a choice rather than a compulsion, carrying with it the genuine warmth that can only emerge from a full rather than empty well. The conversation offered from authentic interest feels entirely different from the conversation provided as a service, both to the giver and receiver. You might recognize this quality in your own experience. Those moments when you felt completely present to someone, not because you had to be, but because you genuinely wanted to be, when your attention felt like a gift rather than a burden. These interactions often carry a particular quality of ease and nourishment for everyone involved, as if the energy that usually goes toward maintaining appropriate responses has been freed up for genuine connection and creative exchange. This brings us to wonder about the relationship between strategic unavailability and what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming authentically yourself. From this perspective, learning to disappoint others' expectations becomes not an act of selfishness, but a necessary step in the development of the capacity for genuine relationship, where two authentic people can meet without the interference of unconscious role-playing and compulsive accommodation. Perhaps you've experienced glimpses of this kind of authentic relationship, those connections where both people can express their real thoughts and feelings, where there's room for disagreement and difference without the threat of abandonment, where love exists for who you are rather than what you provide. These relationships often feel both more challenging and more deeply satisfying than connections based on mutual accommodation, requiring us to develop what Jung saw as the fundamental courage of individuation, the willingness to be misunderstood in service of being authentic. Curiously, this work of learning to be strategically unavailable often requires what might seem like a paradox, becoming temporarily unavailable to others' expectations in order to discover what genuine availability actually feels like. This might involve disappointing people who have become accustomed to a particular version of your service, saying no to opportunities that would reinforce patterns you're trying to change, or simply creating space to listen to your own needs and desires without the constant noise of others' demands. As these insights begin to settle into your awareness like gentle rain nourishing previously neglected soil, you might sense how this understanding transforms the entire question of personal boundaries and self-care from a selfish luxury into a necessary foundation for authentic love and service. When we are no longer unconsciously driven by the need to be needed, we become available to respond to life from our genuine gifts and capacities rather than from our wounds and dependencies. This naturally raises the most profound question of our entire journey. What becomes possible when we fully embrace both the challenges and the liberation of living from our authentic center? And how might this transformation ripple outward to affect not only our individual relationships, but our understanding of what it means to be truly human in relationship with others? As these thoughts about authentic availability settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves approaching the threshold where Jung's psychological insights dissolve into something larger and more mysterious, a recognition that the journey inward toward individual wholeness paradoxically leads us to a deeper connection with the universal human experience, where the boundaries between self and other, inner and outer, Individual healing and collective transformation begin to soften like watercolors blending on wet paper. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast, still lake at dawn, where the surface of the water perfectly mirrors the sky above, creating the momentary illusion that you're suspended between two infinite expanses of space. The air is cool and incredibly clear, carrying the faint scent of pine and wild flowers from the distant shore, while the only sounds are the gentle lapping of water against the rocks beneath your feet and the soft whisper of wind moving through the trees. As you gaze into this perfect mirror, you begin to notice something extraordinary. Sometimes you see your individual reflection clearly defined against the water's surface. But at other moments, the boundary between where you end and the world begins seems to disappear entirely, as if you and the lake and the sky were all expressions of the same fundamental mystery. This lake at dawn becomes a living metaphor for what Jung called the realization of the self, that profound recognition that emerges at the culmination of the individuation journey, where the hard-won understanding of your individual nature opens into an experience of connection with something infinitely larger and more encompassing. Jung understood that the person who has done the difficult work of becoming authentically themselves, paradoxically, discovers that their deepest individual nature is also their most universal nature, connecting them to the timeless patterns and sacred energies that flow through all human experience. Imagine Jung in his final years, sitting in his study at Bollingen overlooking Lake Zurich, where the warm afternoon light filters through windows that have witnessed decades of profound psychological exploration. The familiar scent of pipe tobacco mingles with the lake breeze, as he reflects on a lifetime spent mapping the territories of the human psyche, and you can sense in his weathered face both the satisfaction of work well done and a kind of peaceful wonder at the mystery that always remains beyond complete understanding. His hands, now marked by age but still steady, turn the pages of his journal where he has recorded not answers, but better questions about what it means to be fully human. Perhaps you can sense this quality in your own quieter moments, those times when the usual concerns about identity, achievement, and social positioning fade into the background, replaced by something simpler and more essential. These might occur during periods of deep contemplation, in moments of unexpected beauty, when caring for someone you love, or in those sacred pauses when you feel connected to the mystery and meaning that underlies ordinary experience. There's often a quality of peace that accompanies these moments, as if you've temporarily stepped out of the exhausting work of being someone and into the grace of simply being. Following this thread deeper into Jung's understanding, we discover that this realization of the self doesn't represent an end point, but rather a new beginning, a way of living that remains engaged with the practical challenges of daily existence while drawing from a deeper well of wisdom and compassion. The person who has integrated their shadow, developed a conscious relationship with their persona, and learned to distinguish between authentic and compulsive availability, doesn't withdraw from life, but returns to it with enhanced capacity for genuine service and connection. This brings us to wonder about what Jung saw as the ultimate purpose of individual psychological development, not the creation of perfect, self-contained individuals, but the cultivation of people capable of conscious participation in the collective healing and evolution of human consciousness. When you no longer need to use others to complete your sense of identity or to manage your own internal conflicts, you become available for relationships based on genuine mutuality rather than unconscious dependency or projection. As you contemplate this possibility while gazing into our metaphorical lake, You might notice how the early morning mist begins to lift from the water's surface, revealing previously hidden features of the landscape. Islands that seemed to float in isolation now connected by submerged land bridges. Separate shores revealed as parts of a single, interconnected ecosystem. This natural phenomenon mirrors Jung's insight that individual healing creates the conditions for collective healing. That each person who does the work of becoming consciously whole contributes to the greater work of human awakening. Curiously, this process of psychological integration often leads to what might seem like a paradox. The more authentically individual you become, the more you recognize your fundamental interconnection with all life. The qualities that feel most uniquely yours, your particular blend of strengths and limitations, your specific gifts and challenges, begin to be experienced not as marks of separation, but as your unique contribution to the vast tapestry of human experience. Your individual song becomes a necessary note in the larger symphony of consciousness. Perhaps you've experienced glimpses of this expanded sense of belonging, those moments when your personal struggles suddenly felt connected to universal themes, when your own healing seemed to create space for others to heal as well, or when acts of authentic self-expression inspired similar authenticity in the people around you. These experiences often carry a quality of rightness that transcends personal satisfaction, as if you're temporarily aligned with some larger pattern or purpose that includes but extends far beyond your individual concerns. This understanding transforms the entire question of availability and withdrawal from a personal strategy into a spiritual practice. When you learn to become unavailable to what diminishes your authentic nature, you're not just protecting your individual well-being, but preserving something essential for the collective benefit. Each time you choose truth over convenience, authenticity over approval, conscious response over automatic reaction, you contribute to the expansion of consciousness that benefits everyone who encounters your presence. Interestingly, Jung discovered that people who have done significant inner work often become naturally attractive to others who are ready for their own journey of awakening, while simultaneously becoming less available to those who want to remain unconscious. This isn't a matter of judgment or superiority, but rather a natural consequence of energetic alignment. Like attracts like, and consciousness calls forth consciousness in ways that operate beneath the level of personal intention or effort. As these insights begin to dissolve into your awareness like gentle waves lapping at the shore of consciousness, you might sense how this understanding returns us full circle to where we began, with Jung's observation that when you stop being endlessly available to everyone else's needs and expectations, something miraculous begins to unfold within you. What we now recognize as miraculous is not just individual healing, but participation in the larger healing of human consciousness itself. Put differently, the courage to disappoint others in service of your own truth becomes a form of service to the collective evolution of awareness, creating space for more authentic forms of human connection and understanding to emerge. The person who refuses to sacrifice their authenticity on the altar of social conformity gives others permission to do the same, creating ripples of liberation that extend far beyond their immediate relationships. Picture yourself now as both the individual who has journeyed deep into self-understanding and as part of the vast lake itself, simultaneously a unique drop of water and an inseparable part of the whole. The boundaries between these perspectives begin to soften and blur, not through confusion, but through a deepening recognition that both are true. You are irreplaceably yourself, and also part of something infinitely larger, individual and universal, separate and connected. a unique expression of the same consciousness that animates all life. As dawn continues to break over our metaphorical lake, the mist rises and dissipates, the water gradually stills to perfect clarity, and the urgent questions that brought you to this exploration begin to settle into peaceful understanding. The work of becoming yourself, with all its challenges and revelations, its periods of withdrawal and return, its moments of confusion and clarity, dissolves into the simple recognition that you have always been and will always be both perfectly yourself and perfectly connected to the mystery that holds us all. Let this understanding float gently through your awareness now as your conscious mind prepares for sleep, trusting that the deeper wisdom we've explored together will continue its quiet work of integration while you rest, weaving Jung's insights into the fabric of your being in ways that will serve not only your own continued awakening, but the healing of our shared human journey toward wholeness. And so Jung's wisdom becomes like a distant bell, still ringing but fading now into the deeper currents of your being, where the courage to become unavailable to what diminishes you merges with the vast quiet that holds all transformation. These insights no longer separate thoughts, but part of the gentle rhythm that carries you beyond the need to understand, beyond the boundaries between sleeping and waking, individual and universal, where your authentic self dissolves into something infinitely larger and more encompassing. No need to hold on to these ideas about withdrawal and return, persona and shadow, for they're already becoming part of the dreaming wisdom that knows without knowing, the space where Jung's own wondering joins the eternal question that asks itself through every human heart seeking wholeness. And perhaps in this dissolving there's the deepest availability of all, not to others' expectations, but to the mystery that breathes you, dreams you, carries you toward morning's distant shore where understanding waits not as knowledge, but as the gentle recognition that you have always been both perfectly yourself and perfectly part of everything, drifting now beyond words into that vast silence where all seeking comes to rest.